Welcome to episode 3 of Channel Legendarium. Today we'll be talking about the rise and fall of Achilles. Achilles is probably one of the most famous heroes to come out of Greek mythology, aside from Hercules and Odysseus. Achilles was the son of Thetis, a sea goddess, and Peleus, a king of the Myrmidons. Now, there was a prophecy that whoever married Thetis, the sea goddess, would be completely overshadowed by the son they had. And if you know Greek mythology, fathers always seem to fear being overshadowed and replaced by their sons. Because of this, both Zeus, king of the gods, and Apollo, the sun god, took a pass on marrying Thetis. However, Peleus, the king of the Myrmidons, married her, and together they had Achilles. From a young age, Achilles trained to be a warrior, and that was a good thing because when he was a young man, Prince Paris, one of the two sons of King Priam of Troy, ran away with Helen, the wife of Menelaus. In some versions of the story, Helen went with him willingly. In others, Paris kidnapped her. Whatever the case, Menelaus was not happy. And Menelaus' elder brother just happened to be Agamemnon, the king of the Greeks. And this turned a royal soap opera into the Trojan War. King Agamemnon put together 1,000 ships from across the Greek kingdom and set sail for Troy. Achilles was in command of 50 of those ships with 50 Myrmidons on board. Today's presentation is going to focus on how the Greeks saw the Bronze Age, the ethics and the morals of the ancient Greeks, and how they relate to today's story, the role of Achilles' mother in creating who he was, the fame and infamy Achilles earned during the Trojan War, and finally his death. Before we begin talking about Achilles, I do need to give you a quick history lesson. The Bronze Age of Greece is when the first Greek kingdom emerged, namely the kingdoms of Minoa and Mycenae. That was from about 1600 to 1200 BC. Around 1200 BC, the Bronze Age collapse happened, and we got 450 years of the Dark Ages. We have very little record of the Dark Ages, but we just know enough to know that it wasn't very nice to live during that time. Greece saw a revival during the Classical Age, which is the time most of us are familiar with. The Iliad, the first great story of Achilles, was written around 750 BC, towards the beginning of the Classical Age, and it was talking about events that happened at least 400 or 450 years ago. The reason why the Greeks set the Iliad during the Bronze Age was because they saw that as a golden age. They saw it as a time of great heroes who went out and fought these incredible battles against these monsters who still roamed the earth, a time of great kings ruling great nations, and they wanted to be like those Bronze Age peoples. And Achilles, of course, to them was one of the greatest heroes from that golden age. I also want to talk to you about two Greek concepts, klos and hubris. Klos is a good thing, hubris is not. Klos tells the ancient Greeks that you should get out there, leave the comforts of home and family and community, do great deeds, win great battles, conquer your enemies, and if you do these things, your name is going to live long after you've turned to dust. However, there's a second part to this, a warning against hubris. Go out, do great things, but don't become too great. Don't think that you're greater than the gods, and certainly don't think you're greater than the gods' laws. Take a look at the left and you will see Icarus. His father built wings made out of wax that allowed them to fly. However, the father knew to stay low to the ground and away from the sun. Icarus chose to ignore this warning, flew too high, and his wings wound up melting, and he fell into the ocean. And this is what the Greeks believed happened to those who tried to fly too high, become too great, and acted like they were more important than the gods. And as you'll see, Achilles possessed both klos and hubris in great quantities. Thetis, Achilles' mother, wanted him to be immortal very badly. First, she covered him with ambrosia, the food of the gods, and burned it off him, hoping that it would burn away his mortality. Then she took him to the river Styx, which is the river that separates the land of the living from the land of the dead in Greek mythology. She dipped him into the water so that he would become invincible. However, there was only one part of his body that was not covered, and that was his heel. In one version of the story, it was just because Thetis was holding him by the heel, so that didn't get put underwater. However, in another version of the story, his father Thetis insisted that Achilles be given one weak spot so that he would remain human, that he would remember that he was not a god, and that he would follow the gods' laws. Unfortunately, these were lessons that Achilles did not learn. Next, Thetis took Achilles to go see Hephaestus, the smith of the gods. Hephaestus made Achilles a suit of armor, a sword, and a shield. While they didn't make him invincible per se, they were so beautiful and so different from anything that came before that people could recognize Achilles just by looking at his armor. And thus armed, he went off to the Trojan War. The Trojan War lasted for about 9 years. In fact, the Iliad by Homer focuses upon a few weeks within the 9th year. Now, Agamemnon, who I mentioned before is the king of the Greeks, was forced to give some slaves back to Troy after Apollo spread a plague among the Greeks to punish them for destroying a Trojan temple. Now, Agamemnon was very angry that a newly acquired slave girl he had went back to the Trojans, so out of jealousy and spite he forced Achilles to give back a slave girl named Briseis. While Achilles did as his king asked, he refused to fight any further. He went into his tent, sat in the sand, and basically refused to come out. This would have disastrous results for the Greeks. Hector, who was the second son of King Priam of Troy, grew so bold that he had his soldiers camp outside Troy's high walls so they could make life even harder for the Greeks. He inflicted defeat after defeat upon them, to the point where Agamemnon went to Achilles' tent and begged him to return, offering him gold and silver and all manner of shiny if he would just help him beat back Hector. But Achilles kept refusing, both out of his wounded pride and also because he had a prophecy that he would never go home again if he continued to fight. However, Achilles did get a reason to fight when he agreed to let his cousin Patroclus wear his armor instead of him. And when Patroclus went out into the battlefield, Hector sought him out, recognized Achilles' armor, and killed him. This finally did what all of the threats and all of the gold and all of the bribes never could do. It got Achilles out of his tent and back into the fight. Now, this is where we see the hubris of Achilles. Now, Achilles has already shown close by being willing to leave his mother and his father, his home, and any hope of a normal life behind so that he could win glory in foreign lands. However, his close walked hand in hand with his hubris. When he rejoined the fight, he slaughtered so many Trojan soldiers that he blocked up the river Scamander. And the god of the river Scamander, Xanthus, actually came out of the water and told him to stop throwing all of these dead Trojans into his river. Achilles was so angry that he attacked the river god, and the river god responded by sweeping him downriver. If not for intervention by the gods, Achilles would have drowned. Now, you'd think that most men would have learned their lesson from this. Unfortunately, the hubris of Achilles is so strong that he simply can't learn his lesson from this. He meets Hector again outside the gates of Troy. They do battle, and Achilles kills him. Hector was the greatest champion of the Trojans, and this made Achilles the greatest Greek hero. Now, it wasn't enough to simply kill the man who killed his beloved cousin. He lashed his body to his chariot and drove him 3 times around the walls of Troy. You have to keep in mind this was a tremendous sacrilege to the ancient Greeks, sacrilege being a crime against the gods. In Greek religion, the body had to be carefully preserved so that it could be washed, given coins, and given funeral rites for the afterlife. If the body was soiled, things wouldn't work properly. And Achilles wasn't just dragging Hector through the dust. Remember, he's being dragged behind his horses, who are urinating and defecating on the ground, thus soiling Hector further. In fact, in the poem, the horses are described as weeping, probably in part because they know they've offended the king of the gods, Zeus. Zeus himself was so angry about Achilles' desecration and soiling of Hector's body that he himself had to go down there and tell Achilles to knock it off. And you'd think that most people, after having a talking to from the king of the gods, would start to change their ways. But the hubris of Achilles and the anger of Achilles was so strong that he would not change until King Priam himself came to his tent and begged for his son's body. Now, King Priam was ultimately able to win some mercy from Achilles by reminding him of his own father back in Myrmidon, who didn't know if his son was going to come back alive or dead. And Achilles wept largely because he knew that he was not going to go home alive. And indeed, he was right. By the end of his adventure, he had just angered the gods so much that there's no way he's walking away from this. In fact, Apollo, the sun god, went to Paris, the one who started this whole thing. Now, Paris was widely derided as a coward, for good reason. While he was with his wife Helen, he was allowing his brother Hector to fight his battles for him and ultimately die for him. However, the gods gave Achilles an especially inglorious end by having him die at the hands of one of history's greatest cowards. Paris took a bow and arrow, was guided by Apollo, and shot an arrow straight through Achilles' heel. Achilles died before seeing the end of the Trojan War. And while Achilles' life was indeed glorious, we are talking about him over 3,000 years later, so he certainly won his Klaus, but at the same time he was destroyed by his hubris. Had he not so ignored the gods' laws and acted as if the gods were under him rather than over him, perhaps he would have lived to a ripe old age, and like Odysseus did. Well, that's the end for the third episode of Channel Legendarium. Thank you for watching. I'll see you around.